Hey guys, I've had this drone now for over 1 year. I've had this drone since release. I've been flying consistently with the drone since release. There's been a lot of tips and tricks that I've learned the hard way that I'm gonna share with you today that might save you. Alright, so moving on to tip number 1. Now every time you go out flying, there's always two words that you want to hear. And that is home point updated.
Home point updated.
This is something that will save your ass down the line. Now, if you don't have a home point updated and you run into any sort of issues where you lose your connection with the remote controller, or you're running low on battery and your drone wants to return to home, you're just gonna end up with a drone that's gonna land randomly out in the forest or in the ocean or whatever. From my experience, this is a thing that's very easy to forget when you go out flying. Sometimes you have to let your drone sit for a while before that sound comes. Because if you just take off and fly for too fast, your drone won't set that home point because of connection issues and stuff like that. So I've also find it easier to let your drone hover a bit for the connection to establish, and then it will say home point updated. So that's gonna be my tip number 1. Wait until you hear home point updated. That's gonna save you. Alright, so tip number 2. Don't be afraid of using your drone. Now, this is something I was really struggling with when I bought the drone. I always found myself going like, every time I took off with the drone, it felt like the military and the police were gonna come break down my house and break down my door. But really, the more I used the drone, the more comfortable I got with it. So that's gonna be my tip number 2. Like, use your drone because you are in your rights to fly it and you're not doing anything wrong. And the more you fly with your drone, it's gonna feel better and you're gonna be more comfortable, and because of that you're gonna enjoy it more. And actually, most people from my experience, most people think it's cool that you fly a drone, because in my head I always thought that people were gonna come scream and yell at me for flying the drone, because you see a lot of bad stuff about drones in the news. You know, every time you hear or read about a drone in the news, it's always like these drones spying, or there's a drone attack, or it's like, so people have this negatively, the word drone is negatively loaded for a lot of people. But that, from my experience, as I said, most people think it's actually very cool that you have a drone. I think it's mostly old people that you need to watch out for. Alright, so moving on to tip number 3. Shoot in 30 frames per second. You've probably heard all over the internet that you should shoot in 24 frames per second to get that cinematic look. But trust me, when you're flying a drone, you really want to shoot in 30 frames per second. And I'm going to tell you the reason why you should do that. Now, you have to understand something, that the drone moves way faster than a handheld camera, for example. And the closer you fly your drone to the ground, the more movement you're gonna see in the frame, right? And the further you are away from the ground, there's gonna be less movement in the frame. Now, because there's a lot of movement in the frame, 24 frames per second isn't really doing it, right? So you're gonna end up, what's gonna happen is that you're gonna end up with stuttery and choppy footage. Now, this took me ages to figure out. And this was really revolutionary to me when I found out that shooting in 30 frames got rid of that choppy, stuttery footage. And I have a clip here from a film I just saw. It's the Equalizer 3. I think this is what happens here. If you see at the start of this clip, you can really see that it's smooth and nice. And then it gets a lot of movement, and you can see that just that choppiness and that stuttering is just terrible to look at. And then at the end of the clip here, you can see that it's back to normal again. I don't know, but I'm assuming this is because they're filming in 24 frames per second. So if you find yourself looking at the footage and you see that stuttery, choppy footage, that's the reason. So, and you don't really have to sacrifice. Like, I shoot all my videos in 30 frames per second. You still get that cinematic look, in my opinion. And yeah. Alright, tip number 4. Don't push your battery. Now, this is something I did, and I almost lost my drone because of it. Now, what do I mean by that? So when your battery gets to around 15%, I think, it will say returning to home, low battery, and you have the option to cancel that return to home. And what happened to me was that I pushed my battery because I really wanted a shot that in my brain I thought like, okay, I still have enough battery to get the shot and fly the drone back home. So I tapped to cancel, and this also goes back to my tip number 1. I didn't have a home point. So what happened was that I didn't have a home point and I pushed my battery too far, and I think it's around 5%, like it will just ignore whatever you say and it will just land. I was on a mountain that day and my drone just emergency did an emergency landing randomly on that mountain, and I was extremely lucky that I could collect my drone, because that mountain has had a lot of steep hills and there was like a limited space where I could actually walk. Now the reason I think the drone just emergency lands at 5% is because I think it needs that last battery for the find my drone feature where you can use the flash MB to be able to find the drone. So yeah, don't push your battery. Just if your drone wants to return to home, let it return to home. It is not worth it. Tip number 5, if you're looking for that nice smooth cinematic look, you should also be flying slowly. So I always find myself thinking that I was flying slowly, but it looked really good on the remote controller. But as soon as I got back home and I looked at the bigger monitor, I could see that the movement was too fast. So if you think you're flying slowly, you should probably double down and fly even slower. So alright guys, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. That would mean the world to me, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Fly safe.